Identity appears to be an almost self-explanatory term. In its most raw form, identity amounts to a description of oneself, who one is, aside from being just oneself. It serves identification of an individual, a group, or an individual within the respective group, based on a more familiar standardized characteristic that will allow one to understand whom they are dealing with prior to getting to know better the person in question. For some clarity as for what a standardized characteristic is, some such characteristics are relatively few, very broad and generalized, and shared by very large groups of individuals, but self-evident without or with little additional explanation required. For example, man, woman, child. As once presented with these words, one's mind most likely has sparked with some sort of respective representations of these concepts. Then we find a secondary type of a characteristic which is acquired rather than inborn, more specific and pertaining to a particular function in various contexts, therefore more diverse due to a larger number of various functions multiplied by vast number of possible contexts. Here's some examples, like plumber, artist, politician, student, philosopher, teacher, mother, father, priest, believer, scientist, etc. Again, you have probably roughly imagined appropriate avatars performing their respective activities in some manner. If one does not recognize a characteristic, all one needs is inquire, and one receives a functional description to operate on. This is because such descriptive characteristics carry established meanings with them, warranting recognition based on how these meanings are disseminated among the general population. So to wrap it up, a standardized characteristic is an identifier where based on its appropriate notion one derives their understanding of what given identifier says about the primary function of a person identified in such manner. Identifier will be the working term onwards. Some other powerful identifiers for your consideration loosely contained within their own properties may be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, transgender, straight, black, white, native, Asian, disabled, vegan, activist, feminist. Demonstrably, identifiers operate on very diverse terms, with only one required condition. They must refer to persons existing in accordance with the identifier's semantic framework. A spoon has no identity, despite being fairly easy to identify. This is because a spoon does not enter an interaction of its own volition, nor is it self-aware enough to identify itself, much less to operate as an authority in the dimension of being a spoon. Do note, the issue of lacking self-informed interactions shows up for certain demographics as well, such as very young humans, or people with certain cognitive disabilities and possibly some others. Yet still, these demographics are normally spoken for by appointed representatives of some kind, be it parents, legal guardians, etc., so this issue is more or less resolved through legal regulation but still must pertain to humans. Primary function implied by an identifier can, and in most cases will, carry further implied information contextually. For instance, knowing what a teacher generally does, one could create a mental image of a person in that particular functional dimension, and draw a loose set of assumptions about them. Let's say that a teacher is a specialist in a field, possesses and relays knowledge, and possibly skills like critical thinking, problem solving, and social conditioning, etc. Some other notions may apply as well, and whatever the case may be, one is all set to begin pertinent interaction. One derives more specific information from a more specific identifier, such as, for instance, physics teacher. All this does not mean one cannot teach without adopting the identifier of a teacher, as well as the identifier does not imply teaching is the only thing that teacher does. The identifier exists to frame a specific purpose a person becomes identified by, irrespective of other areas of life they participate in. I have outlined how identifiers, including the ones mentioned so far, describe a pragmatic, functional dimension in which an individual wishes to operate in a given interaction, be it social or interpersonal, or is being wished, as it were, by secondary parties to be discussed as, in a manner pertinent to the context used. From that shift in the origin of identification, the teacher themselves as opposed to people who interact with them, come most stereotypes. Common and justified assertion here being that somebody being a teacher will intrinsically have more adequate insights on the experience of being a teacher than some secondary party who isn't one. Conversely, secondary parties will inevitably possess impressions from experience of interacting with the teacher while not being teachers themselves. This creates a useful, if not necessary, role distribution for potential interactions involving teachers. However, since such impressions tend not to remain contained within an instance of interaction, this also leads to creating broader perceptions of all teachers, based on the impressions of undisclosed number of non-teachers that can be summarized and disseminated without accounting for the individual personalities of those who are teachers, leading to those individuals being reduced to their function, and perceived through the common concept of that function. On top of that, not only do the impressions come from specific interaction, but also from imagination. For instance, a specialist in a field may derive their mannerisms or even worldview from that field. Some, or arguably most, of the identifiers mentioned to this point began as mere conceptualizations of a set of behaviors, customs, preferences, appearances, and other such properties attributed to individuals exhibiting largest correlation with those behaviors, customs, preferences, etc. In short, if you exhibit ABC traits, you become identified as XYZ, and so, if you're identified as XYZ, it is reasonable to assume you're likely to exhibit ABC traits. It is also worth mentioning that some identities are ones that an individual can consciously apply to themselves by adjusting their behaviors to resemble those more commonly associated with a respective set of socially recognized attributes, while others are being given irrespectively of one's preference due to the identified individual's inherent traits. Wherein lies something that identity politics are rumored to counter, like gender, racial, ethnic, or other inborn traits, generalizations, by definition erasing one's individual lived experiences while adhering to an identity. One can assess an individual's place and function in society as well as attempt a prediction of that individual's behaviors, convictions, or beliefs without even inquiring about any of these. That assessment appears true both for an identity and a prejudice. If these are likened by this observation, what constitutes the difference between an identity and a prejudice? Take note how much of a dilemma it may prove to differentiate between predicating an identity and doubting a prejudice simply in order to preemptively absolve oneself of rash and ignorant judgments that one is about to make either way. And the result is dualistic. In a single instance, it may be disregarding a prejudice which may benefit the individual and the society as a whole, as well as erasing an identity which is detrimental to one's self-image and society as a whole. The difference seems to lie mainly in who's doing it and whom it pertains to. Progressive social justice movements ostensibly oppose stereotyping people based on their identifiers as potentially harmful for individuals and as too prone to become antagonistic prejudices. Those movements profess to take informed means to dispose of these harmful stereotypes that would be quicker than any organic societal adjustment could possibly warrant due to norms shifting so slowly. What could those means possibly be? Note that existing normativities of sexual, racial, or economic notions are most commonly attacked as outdated, despite being a result, rather than a cause, of historically recorded trends in Western societies. Seemingly, due to the nature of progressivism, the desired change is supposed to come about through artificial counter-normalization, by singling out identities representative of existing norms as those without valid perspectives on progress, due to them being a product of the past, and therefore expected by default to make the mistake of projecting their privileged, normalized standpoint on any presented issue, as well as, again by default, disqualifying the viewpoints of other categorized identity groups that happen not to represent a norm of its given society. All this is based on identities, with a distinct rule of thumb. Whichever identity is most generic in a given instance, this particular voice is to be disregarded, which is functionally a prejudice that works brilliantly in favor of whoever takes up the role of self-appointed savior of the marginalized. Because among identities of those oppressed, the norm lies with the oppressed themselves, as those with any sort of respective internalized ism that is inherent in the norms, thus giving way to representation by those who proclaim themselves free of the contemporary burdens, so-called allies of those whose wishes are routinely disregarded, by the same allies who take a stand to demand a sympathetic ear to the plea of their wards. So how does an identifier, this erasure of one's informed individuality, differ from a stereotype? Firstly, a stereotype is an instance of profiling conducted a posteriori after loosely defining, by either an inborn or acquired characteristic, a concerned party demographic with an established commonality, in the way that picks up highlighted traits of that demographic to create a sense of representation of persons belonging to it, while an identity is an individual sense of personhood kept in relation to other people who happen to share certain, assessed a priori, attributes of that respective identity, thus creating a collective, which stereotypes apply to. Secondly, not only do identity politics imply an influence an identity's function within a society, they also make it so that to different identifiers, different measurements apply. Like the oddly popular notion that racial minorities cannot be meaningfully racist toward the majority because of a lack of power, or that women cannot be sexist against men based on the same presupposed power imbalance. This multiple standard is rationalized by delivering additional qualifiers, assigned arbitrarily and informed by little more than what an identity has been said to function as, in effect limiting every individual's personal agency and personhood to the content of an arbitrary set of qualifiers, tied to a given identifier. Identity is said to take into consideration the intimate insights on belonging to it, as stereotype acknowledges none of it. Incidentally, neither do identity politics, if the identity being talked about is the wrong one, as in at odds with the speaker's preference, justified again with the speaker's identity. What constitutes the main similarity between an identity and a stereotype? Take all the things said up to this point about identities and play it out in a scenario where the one using it as an individual representing an identity that is established to be in some sort of a dissonance with proper social well-being. In such a case, this individual is guilty of unfairly disparaging people based on how they look, speak, behave, whom they sleep with, what they eat. This individual is stereotyping. And this is explained not by their sentiment, experiences, convictions, or even the knowledge per se. This is attributed entirely to who they are. Their personhood is being erased in favor of identifying them and writing off as a yet another example of a wrong identity, behaving in an undesirable but expected manner. Now for some closing thoughts on the working dichotomy of identity politics. Two prevalent extremes come to mind. One is special snowflake effect. Because of the identity politics concept's a priori nature outlined earlier, it is possible to create identities based on fusions of either existing characteristics that are less likely to manifest in a single wholesome individual, or redefining states of human condition that aren't human characteristics into being just that, then going from there. This way, while existence of a stereotype is predicated on an identified collective of humans, that identity itself can be crafted artificially, ostensibly to prevent creation of a, potentially harmful because of inaccuracy, stereotype by making it this much less likely to create collectives of people based off that particular unlikely fusion of traits. This showcases the short-sightedness of critical theory or progressive movement in general that does not count on society finding a way to stereotype the living hell out of people fabricating characteristics to avoid being stereotyped, which is obviously a behavioral characteristic by itself. The opposite dynamic is what I call a mob rule effect. The thing that the most people agree with is the most right thing for all. That means majority aligning with that thing indicate that this thing is the best for all to the best of most people's judgment. That also means that divergence from that trend is at a disadvantage irrespectively of the objective pragmatic merit of their conviction, dooming one to be disregarded. These two dynamics are disingenuously attempted to be reconciled by the construct of political correctness, which serves as a prefabricated resource of relatable thought processes that are moderate enough for all fronts to be acceptable, but functioning as an arbitration on what sorts of opinions are acceptable and which are not. I'm sure I'll be taking an extended crack at the conundrum of political incorrectness at some point. Identity politics render identity to be the most inert trait in a person. Its proponents will have us believe we are born into an identity, regardless of what kind of person we grow to be. We cannot get rid of certain identifiers unless we become completely anonymous. All this may be argued to be a good thing, serving against the ratio of identities in favor of one supremacy or another, but in reality, it's always used to have somebody heard at the expense of somebody else. In short, in identity politics, identities cancel each other out. Do not presume to be heard if you belong to the wrong identity. I am done reasoning.